Hello, I'm Stephen Taylor, and I'm one of the CIPD's chief moderators. And in that role, I set questions in line with the Institute's assessment criteria, and I take a lead role in the moderation of the assignments and the marking after you have written them, after they've been marked. And the purpose of this presentation is really to brief you and assist you as you start working on the assignments, particularly in this presentation for work and working lives in a changing business environment. That's CC001. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do is have some general guidance first. So I'll give you some general advice, the sort of things we're looking for, what we'd like you to demonstrate as a level 7 learner. And then I will go on after that to give you some brief specific guidance, help, pointers in respect of each of the questions that we've set for this year and that you'll be working on. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are going to start with some general guidance. Please do ask your tutors if you have any further questions, if there's anything I say that you'd like some clarification on, they are there to help you with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so C001, Work and Working Lives in a Changing Business Environment, is a core unit, so everybody has to study it. However, they are attaining their CIPD qualifications, their CIPD membership. It is essay-based, the assessment, and the assessment is set by CIPD. You'll find 16 questions which we have covering each of the assessment criteria, and learners are expected to prepare all 16 questions. You don't need to write all 16 questions, but you need to have a look at all 16 questions, perhaps plan answers so that you are covering all the required learning outcomes or the required assessment criteria for this particular module. Now, you will actually only be assessed on 4 of the 16, and one of each of those 4 will come from a different learning outcome, so that you will do 4 answers to questions, 4 of the 16, covering between them each of the 4 main learning outcomes on this unit. So that's the way the system works. We have the next slide, please. Okay, so the way it is that each of the 4 questions can be answered fairly concisely, quite briefly. You will submit the 4 answers to the 4 questions that you're set for your assessment window, and around 1,000 words for each of them. You put them all together in a single document, and it's like a single piece of work with 4 separate parts to it of around 1,000 words. So that gives you a total word count of 4,000 words, but we allow plus or minus 10%. So you can go below 4,000 or up to 4,400. And you can exclude your references too. If you want to write a little bit more on one of the questions, that's fine. So it's not specifically exactly 4,000 words, but in the region of 4,000 words. And of course, this is a level 7 qualification, so we're looking for a number of things particularly. Firstly, we're looking for you to demonstrate both depth and breadth of knowledge and understanding in respect of each of the learning outcomes, but each of the assessment criteria too. So it's about depth of analysis and it's about breadth of knowledge. We want to know that you have developed good, proper, authoritative knowledge and understanding of the subjects that you're studying. We then need to see you developing an argument. We don't want answers which are simply descriptive. We don't want you simply to summarize your reading. That's very straightforward to do, but that's not quite what we're looking for at level 7. We want you to say what you think, and all the questions will be asking you to express a view. And we want you to then justify that view by drawing on your reading, drawing on examples from your own experience, things you've observed in your professional career, We'd like you to use published research to justify your points, and lots of examples, and wherever possible, some statistics. So it's about putting forward an argument in answer to the question, but also justifying it credibly and persuasively. And that will involve sources. You need to cite your sources in your answers. And of course, those must be authoritative, credible sources. You're not just citing, a website you happen to have come across, or an article in a tabloid newspaper or something like that. Perfectly good to get ideas from those sources, perfectly useful. Sometimes you get some good examples from those type of sources, but we do need to see that you're engaging with credible sources of literature too. Next slide, please. Again, these are some of the things that are expectations of people working on an advanced diploma at level 7. So first of all, we need to see that you have become an independent learner, that you're not just reading specific things, specific articles and so on that you've been told to read. But you're sourcing your own material. You're getting out there, you're typing things into search engines, you're tracking down the right articles, the research, the statistics, all of those kind of things, and you are confident doing that. So that's a really important part of advanced diploma level. Obviously, we also need to be sure that you are well informed about the subject, and I think to an extent also interested in the subject. You can write with some enthusiasm, you can engage the person reading your work, and that's again something we're looking for. The way you communicate has to be done effectively, professionally. We also want to see that you have read widely, and that you have developed really intellectual confidence, a genuine understanding of the subject, and that you can draw on that reading effectively to justify the points you're making in answer to the questions. Developing an argument, therefore, is central, crucial, vital at level 7. And the style, the presentation style, we don't ask for anything particularly specific there beyond a professional writing style, so that you are writing to a reasonable professional standard. Okay, can we have the next slide? So what I'm now going to do is talk you through each of the 16 questions. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you exactly what to say, partly because there is necessarily no right answer. Each answer will be different because we're looking for original argument. But I can give you some hints, some suggestions, some pointers, just the sort of way you might like to approach each of these 16 questions. So we'll start with the first one. We have the next slide. Here we go. So question number 1 this year. You can remember there are 16 questions, and 4 cover each of the 4 learning outcomes. The first learning outcome is all about long-term trends in our business environment, how those are affecting employment, how those are affecting the world of work and the world of HR, people management, and so on. So the first question is, to what extent do you agree with the view? You can see there that we're asking for an opinion. To what extent do you agree with the view that the trend towards greater globalization has peaked and that its extent will decline in the next few years? Assess in what major ways a retreat from globalization would affect employment markets in your country. Now you'll see here that there are 2 parts, so you need to address both parts of that question reasonably fully. It doesn't mean you have to give precisely the same attention, it doesn't have to be 500 words on each, but that you provide a reasonably full answer to both questions. And the first one really is looking to the future. So you're looking at this argument that says, well, we've been through a big period of great globalization and that's now coming to an end. And a lot of people make that argument. You will not find it difficult to find that argument being put. But we'd like you to think about it in a critical way. Don't just accept that that is true. It may be true in some ways and not in others. Remember, globalization has lots of different elements to it. And we're probably mostly here thinking about the globalization of product markets, so the growth of multinational corporations, international markets, supply chains, the supply of goods and services across national borders, but also importantly for us as people management professionals, of course, is the globalization of labor markets and the way that organizations seek out different labor markets. They locate their industries in different places around the world to access labor. And also, of course, we have the issue of migration and people moving from one country to another, either because they are being moved by an employer or simply to look for work in another country. So there are lots of different aspects to globalization. It may be that parts of it's peaked, parts of it haven't. You may disagree that any of it's peaked. You put your argument, develop your argument. The point is that you're looking to the future, but you're probably drawing on past trends, looking at the causes of globalization in order to make that argument. And then the second part, of course, is about the specific impact on employment markets in your country, on labor markets in your country. So when they're talking about supply and demand of labor, what sort of effect is it going to have? Is it going to make greater skill shortages? Is it going to loosen the labor market? A bit of each. What's it going to do to pay? What's it going to do to job security? Those kind of questions. And again, remember, with all of these, the importance of justifying your argument. Don't just assume that it's obvious to the reader what the reason for your position is. You need to justify, and you use examples and statistics, research findings, just logical arguments based on your understanding of the subject and past trends and so on, in order to justify your argument. We have the next slide, please. Okay, so question number 2 is about technology, really important contemporary development, of course. And this one is really focused on long-term trends in the area of technology, information technology. So I'll just read the question. It is commonly argued that developments in the field of information technology will soon create machines with general artificial intelligence and are able to do anything the human brain can do, including generating new scientific knowledge. Critically evaluate the ways in which this development will affect employment in your industry or sector. Justify your answer with at least one example. So you can use more than one example, but we do need at least one example here. And it is very much focused on your industry, your sector, not a general one. So this is quite specific to a particular industry. Now, much of the writing on this subject looks at the destruction of some jobs, the creation of new jobs, and that's part of this, and certainly something we would want you to have a look at in respect of your industry. The development of general artificial intelligence is typically associated with machines being able to do work that higher paid, higher skilled specialist people, knowledge workers, currently do, and to do it more productively, more quickly than they can. And that's relatively new. That's not something we've had a lot of historically. So there's that aspect to it. But don't just look at that question of destruction of jobs, the creation of new jobs and so on, not just about the churn in jobs, but it's also about other aspects of employment, again, job security and the implications of that, and also, of course, pay. Always very important. And anything else in your industry that you think is relevant. And again, remember to justify the argument you make. Next slide, please. Okay, so number 3, this is about demographics. Again, we're dealing with some pretty big issues on this module. Explain why the population in most countries is aging rapidly. Illustrating your answer with examples, evaluate how this trend is creating challenges for people professionals in organizations. And again, you see here there are 2 parts to the question, so you need to give proper full attention to both parts of the question. The first part is really about the reasons for population aging. So this is to do with long-term trends, not in every country of the world, but in many countries of the world, where people are having fewer children and we are living longer, and that combined, the mortality rates declining, the fertility rates declining, creates an aging population. It's more advanced in some countries than in others, and As soon as you start investigating it, researching it, you'll be able to find some statistics to illustrate these points. So the first point is explaining why it is. And the second part is then how is it creating challenges for people professionals? And if you have an aging workforce, well, then you're going to be looking at people approaching retirement, older people sometimes you have a choice about how they work, when they work, who they work for, not under the same economic pressures necessarily that younger people are. There are all kinds of implications for employing those people effectively. Think about recruitment, retention, performance management, flexible working. All of those kind of arguments will come into this. Again, you construct the argument that makes best sense to you, but justify it. Make it persuasive. Make sure that it's not just, this is my opinion, but this is my opinion, and this is why I have reached that opinion. And you want to use authoritative sources when justifying your argument. We have the next slide, please. So question number 4. Over time, across the world, societies are becoming more affluent, but also more unequal. To what extent do you agree with the view that employment practices are the cause of these trends? Well, again, with this, the temptation would be to focus on inequality more than increased affluence, just because so much more is written about growing inequality, and it hits the headlines. It's something we're very aware of, but also very important to remember that we are, as societies, and have been for many decades, becoming more affluent. We have more disposable income, big growth in luxury brands. People spend money on things that are not considered necessities necessarily, or would historically have been necessities. So there are two aspects to this, and you do need to give equal attention to both. And the question is, how much of this is employment related? Some is, some isn't. And again, the way that you make your argument, the more authoritative is, the better your mark will be. I'll just give you an example to illustrate what I mean. So if you're looking at growing inequality, the rate at which senior executive pay has increased in recent years over and above average pay is astonishing. People at the top of organizations, particularly in the private sector, have done extremely well. And that is certainly an HR related or an employment related matter. And that is something that has contributed towards greater inequality, is contributing towards greater inequality. But there are other things, for example, the rate of change in the education system, not really being able to keep up with the rate of change in the economy, creating a skills mismatch. So that people are coming out of schools with sets of, and universities with sets of skills that aren't necessarily perfectly aligned to the needs of the wider economy. And that creates inequality because it means that some people are better able to find work than others. You have tight labour markets, you have loose labour markets, and pay goes up in the tight labour markets. That's employment related, but it's not really management related. That's a structural issue in the economy generally. So again, that's the sort of thing you might like to look at when discussing these issues. And again, the importance of justification. Make your case, justify your case really persuasively. Next slide, please. So we're moving on now to the second learning outcome, which is more about short-term contemporary developments in the business environment. So in what ways are developments in technology currently affecting the management of people within your organization or one that is familiar to you, and your own work as a people professional? Illustrating your answer with two distinct examples, evaluate the major advantages and disadvantages of these developments. So here we're focusing on your organization, on your work. So it's all very personal to you. That doesn't mean though that you don't need to include wider citations, evidence of wider reading. That must inform your answer. And but it is very much an own organisation focused question, this one. And so we're looking here for two distinct examples. Perhaps choose one which is affecting management of people generally in the organisation, and another one that affects you specifically in your work as an HR people management professional. Remember that we're looking for you to evaluate rather than just describe the two examples, and think about the different perspectives, think about the advantages and the disadvantages. Try, if you can, not simply to say this is what's happening in a descriptive way. So do try to think beyond that. Use the reading that you've done to develop your arguments to justify your points. Question number 6, the next one, please. The question number 6, in recent years, governments have raised the education leaving age and have brought in incentives to encourage employers to invest more money in training and development. Assess the purpose of these strategies and evaluate how successful they have been. So we're here again talking really what many countries are doing around the world, many governments are doing around the world, which is upskilling one way or another, trying to develop their people, their human resources generally, so that they are better educated, they have better access to skills development and so on. More money being invested in education, training and development, both by government itself, but also by organizations that then benefit from the higher levels of education, higher levels of skills that we have in our economy. The question asks you to assess their purpose and then to also evaluate their relative success. Again, these are things that are widely discussed in the literature. You will have no problem finding plenty of opinion about these. But again, don't just accept what you read. You decide for yourself what you think the answer to these questions is. Is it successful? How far is it successful? It may have been successful in some industries, not in others. All of these things can potentially come into your analysis. And again, of course, you need to make good justification for the points that you develop in answer to question 6. Next slide, please. Okay, question number 7. So we're here into the world of regulation, which isn't always the most exciting area, but really important and something that we need to be very familiar with and understand. And it's really the principles that we need to understand in HR, in HRD as well. And here we have a question about principles. What are the main principles that underpin health and safety law in your country? Illustrating your answer with examples, assess or analyze why it is the interest of in the interest of employers to comply with these requirements. Now, the first part is to an extent descriptive, but it's not asking just for a description of health and safety law. It does want you to do a little bit more than that. Think about their purpose. What are the core principles that characterize the specific health and safety law regime in your country, both in terms of its content, in terms of how it's enforced, in terms of the methods that have been used to develop it, those sort of things. So it's not just a description that we're looking for there. We're looking for you to do a little bit more than that. And then use examples to analyze why it's in the interest of employers to comply with health and safety. Now, obviously, there's a very obvious answer to that, which is, well, you don't want people injured, you don't want people getting sick, you don't want people getting so stressed that they're taking time off. And you can put a perfectly good business case of that kind. You can put an ethical case of that kind. But there is also, remember, an issue of corporate reputation. And there is also, of course, specifically for this question, an issue of enforcement. The danger of not complying, falling foul of the law, fines and so on. And that also would be part of any good answer to this question. Again, to think broadly, what are those basic principles? What characterizes the health and safety regime in your country? What makes it distinct? And then using some examples, remember to use the examples, illustrate the general question of why it's in the interest of employers to comply. And that will need a little bit of research. We'll need you to find some examples in the literature. Question number 8, please. In most countries, recent years have been ones in which unemployment levels have been low by historic standards. Critically discuss why this situation has evolved. How is it affecting the management of people in your organization? So again, 2 parts. The first part here is looking at the various different factors which have created these tight, relatively tight labour market conditions that we've been experiencing over the last 5 or 10 years. Low levels of unemployment, skill shortages, quite chronic skill shortages in some industries. Why has that happened? And I suggest there you look at both the short-term and the longer-term causes. They've kind of come together. So we have short-term causes like the COVID pandemic and the failure of people to go back to work after the pandemic, people taking early retirement and so on. But there are also all kinds of longer-term, particularly demographic, but also to do with skills and the rate at which the economy is changing really faster than the education system can keep up. Those sort of issues also would be things to consider and think about there. And again, second part, very much then focused on your organization. How is this situation affecting the management of people in your organization? And again, thing to do there really is not just to think about the very obvious points. It is making it harder for us to attract and retain people. But why? What impact does that have on the way you manage people, on the culture of the organization, on the constraints that managers face? So what's the practical impact of long-term chronic skills shortages on the whole way we manage people? That's the sort of thing we would expect a really good answer to include some thinking about. Next slide, please. So question number 9, analyze the effective management and leadership of change in organizations with reference to 2 change management models. Illustrate your answer with examples of how and when the models might help contemporary organizations to manage and lead change effectively, and when the models are less relevant. Now, we're moving on here to the third learning outcome in this unit, which is change and flexibility and issues of that kind. And this is one where you're asked to look at the models of change management. Now, there are several of these. Some of them are really quite old classic ones that are always still being cited and quoted. Others are more recent. You will find plenty of examples if you start digging around in the textbooks, in the literature. I would choose 2 quite distinct models if it was me, and I would then, that would give me more scope. And the second part of the question really is then asking about contemporary organizations. So now, leading and managing change effectively now. How are these models relevant? How are they less relevant? Are they practically useful? If so, how? And again, use some examples to illustrate that in practice. So it's really asking you to critically assess the utility, not the validity so much, the utility, the practical usefulness of 2 published models of change management with a view to very much their use today in organizations presently, currently. Okay, so that's question 9. We have question 10, please. Okay, examine the main causes of resistance to change amongst employees and the way in which people professionals can address this resistance. Again, illustrating your answer with examples. So you see examples are really important as a way of justifying the general points that you make. I think with tackling this one, the best thing to do is to think very broadly about why people resist change and indeed the different ways that they resist change, because often it's very subtle. Often it's kind of apathy, just not really engaging, rather than any overt resistance like a strike or some boycott or something of that kind. There's a big spectrum of change resistance. So think broadly about it. And then what can be done, particularly by people professionals, to address it, both in terms of responding to it when it happens, but also, of course, trying to stop it from happening or minimize the extent that it happens in the first place. And that's clearly all about communication, employee involvement, um, all of those kind of areas that you would like to think about there. And long-term planning, I think, as well, for the process of change. In terms of the first part of the question, examining the main causes of resistance. Well, again, think broadly. These are many. The obvious one is that people are fear for their job, fear for their income insecurity or their income security, and therefore they see themselves as potential losers from a change management program. But it's not only about that. It's often just genuine disagreement about the direction the organization is taking. It can get very political as well. It's different managers, different groups of coalition within an organization um, taking up different positions, really because they're playing a political game, competing with each other. There are all manner of different reasons. And again, as soon as you start digging, as soon as you start reading around the subject of resistance to change, you'll find examples and you'll be able to address this question with authority and make it very interesting too, I suspect. Okay, can we have question number 11? Question number 11, evaluate the case for and against the introduction of a 4-day working week. Illustrate your answer with examples and reference to published research. Well, again, this is such a topical issue presently. The view is being established that it is possible, not in every organization, not in every industry, but in some, to go from a 5-day to a 4-day working week without reducing people's pay and with the same amount of work being done. In other words, people work more smartly, they become more productive, they do as much in 4 days as they do in 5. And there is a benefit for the organization in terms of reduced costs, office facility, and so on. But there's also obviously a benefit for employees in that there's more leisure time, and that's obviously a big, big plus in terms of attracting and retaining people in a tight labour market situation. So lots there to get your teeth into. There's plenty written about this. You'll find, again, a lot is being published recently. The CIPT website's actually a very good place to start on this because that's somewhere that some of these debates have been very heavily developed in recent years. I think the key thing here, though, really is just to accept that there is a limit to how far it can go. There are some industries, some type of jobs where it's not practical to do it because you need to be present on a premises in order to deliver a service or a product. And so there is going to be a limit to how far it can go. And it is important if you want to write with authority to recognize that. So we need a subtle answer here, really. Thoughtful, subtle answer, drawing on current and indeed recent research. Question number 12. Assess how people management practices within your organization, or one that is familiar to you, can promote creativity and innovation. Illustrate your answer with 2 examples of people management practices which promote creativity and innovation. Well, again, this is very commonly written about. You will have no difficulty at all accessing very accessible writing, research, recent research on the issue of creativity, innovation. I think really the key is to keep them separate. They are linked, but they are different. Creativity and innovation are not exactly the same thing, and the question asks for 2 examples. So if it was me, I would choose one focused on creativity specifically, another one on innovation specifically. I would again perhaps take a little bit of a critical view. Is it something that people management practices really can develop, or is it outside the power, the influence, the authority of the people manager? That's for you to decide. Certainly, there are some things that can be done, at least to encourage and promote creativity, innovation, management style issues, reward systems, and so on. Maybe things you might like to look at in answering these. Again, specific examples and justify your argument. Remember when you're writing, how persuasive am I being? I'm setting out my view, I'm developing my argument. I need to justify it really credibly, really persuasively, and that's important in all the questions, but important here too. Okay, question number 13. Critically evaluate the business case for promoting ethical people practices in your own organization, or one that is familiar to you. Illustrate your business case with examples. Okay, so what elements do we have here? Well, it's about a specific organization, your own organization. Whenever we ask these kind of questions with an own organization angle, there is a tendency for people just to describe what currently happens. And that's not what this question is asking you to do. It's asking you to evaluate the business case for further development, more development of ethical people practices. So think about the sort of things that might involve, the kind of costs associated with that. That will all be particular to your organization. Think very broadly about what we mean by ethical people practices. Again, not the same thing as legal. Sometimes we get that with these kind of answers as well. People think, well, if you're acting lawfully, you're acting ethically. No, ethics goes way beyond legality. It's also something, of course, that people disagree with, or disagree about. What's ethical to me might not be ethical to somebody else, and that is a constant issue. So again, focusing on specific examples, focusing on your organization, think it through, and again, just answer it genuinely. What more could be done in your organization from a people management perspective to encourage greater ethicality? And what would be the business case for doing so? Question number 14, please. What 2 distinct recommendations to enhance well-being would you make to the senior leadership team in your organization, or one that is familiar to you? Justify your recommendations with reference to research evidence and explain how you can evaluate the impact of your recommendations. So you see here again 2 parts to the question. It's partly about what you're recommending, and it's partly about how you would then evaluate the impact if those recommendations were put into practice. It's also very, again, focused on your leadership team. So the key there is to avoid simply describing what currently happens. This is about making recommendations to enhance further what you're currently doing on well-being in your organization, and then justifying it with reference specifically to research evidence. Okay, so very straightforward, really. Make 2 recommendations, make sure they're distinct, they're not just the same things. So nice different things in the HR field that you could do, and then justify with research evidence, and then explain how you would evaluate what you've done, how you be sure that what you've done was having a positive impact on well-being. Again, pretty straightforward. Question number 15, please. Critically evaluate the options for your organization, or one that is familiar to you, to improve its record in the area of sustainability. Identify 2 distinct interventions that will not be too expensive to implement. What would you recommend and why? Well, again, rather similar to the previous 2 questions. This is about looking at the future. In this case, it's more about options than specific interventions, but we want you to identify 2 interventions that would help you with those options. And again, we don't want things that are really, really elaborate and really, really expensive, but quick wins, easy wins, things that could be done in your organization. Again, beyond what you're currently doing. Don't just describe what you're currently doing in sustainability. What could be done further in the future? Again, 2 examples, and justify your choice. And again, it's asking you, I think, really to make a business case for this, for greater attention to sustainability. And then we have the final question, number 16. Critically discuss how equality, diversity, and inclusion efforts could be more impactful in your own organization or one that is familiar to you. Again, really straightforward. It's about your own organization again, or one you're very knowledgeable about. It doesn't have to be your own organization, but most people will choose their own organization. And again, please avoid simply describing what you're currently doing. This is about more impactful. It's about improving wherever you are currently, about making it more impactful in the future. I would think about equality, diversity, and inclusion as separate things. Don't just lump them all together as the same thing. They are different. And a subtle answer will do that. And it's simply asking you to put forward some suggestions and justify those suggestions. That might be completely new things, or it may be improving on existing interventions that you're already doing. But again, it's about making things better than currently and justifying your points. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? That's the end. It's the end of the webinar. So I hope you found that useful and that it's hopefully enthused you a little bit for the task of writing these assignments. It should be a really engaging learning experience. You need to give plenty of time to it. You need to give plenty of time for research, planning. Don't leave it to the last minute. And see if you can write a really strong set of assignments, thinking it through, doing your research, justifying your points, writing originally, lots of good examples. Those are all the things to try and do. Thank you very much.